Had not a 32-year-old Afghan Ukrainian journalist named Mustafa Naim not posted on Facebook in Russian a little note on November 21st saying, hey, let's be serious. If you're really upset, come out to the Maidan by midnight tonight. And he said, likes do not count. One of the things Maidan did was bring me back to that moment when I first became, enchanted with this whole part of the world, with Eastern Europe. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, it was one of those things that felt inconceivable and impossible until the moment that it happened, and then in retrospect it seemed inevitable. The Soviet Union seemed like it would go on forever. The Soviet project was arguably the largest, deepest, most far-reaching experiment in social engineering that has ever been performed on mankind. And in some sense, we are still grappling with the sheer scope of the experiment and the sheer magnitude of the failure, of the catastrophe. It was not just an attempt, to remake a government, and it wasn't even just an attempt to remake a society. It was an attempt to remake human beings. It was an attempt to create a new kind of human being. The world was divided into two camps. There was an iron curtain. And then one day it was over. Soon enough afterwards, the Soviet Union seemed to dissolve. Ukraine, as you probably heard, got its independence to a certain extent by default, but also with some agitation and with some desire on the part of the population. In the West, we were celebrating, the Wicked Witch is dead, and now we all live happily ever after. That was the paradigm. That now that communism had failed, and now we knew that, in fact, the locomotive of history was leading towards liberal democracy. But something we perhaps didn't appreciate so much was just how brutal the 1990s were for the societies that were coming out of communism.
The only time Russia experimented with quote-unquote democracy was the period between 1991 and 1999, when Vladimir Putin becomes prime minister and eventually president. That period is probably one of the most traumatic periods in the history of anyone alive in Russia today. You went from a poor and unfree society, which was the Soviet Union, in which most people didn't really know how poor and how unfree they were, to a society of complete chaos, rampant crime. You were a university professor with a respectable job, and tomorrow you were selling your belongings in the street. Suddenly, your son was shipped off to fight in Chechnya, which you'd never heard of before, and your daughter was a prostitute. Because that was how quickly the society changed. I'm not saying that was every single person's experience, but we all knew somebody. We all knew somebody a woman who'd fallen prey to the slave trade, or a person who, lost a son in Chechnya, or was wounded, or was sent to the military, or someone who ended up going from being wealthy to being in extreme poverty, people who drank themselves to death, people who took drugs and overdosed on drugs. And the thing that was most important about that, and everything you'd worked for, all your savings, gone. Think about that. Think how shocking that is to people. It's hard to imagine. People will listen to this and go, oh, but you can't imagine it. Everything in your life, think about your life now, your family, your friends, your finances, how much money you have, your job, all of that gone through no fault of your own. And suddenly it's chaos. And you are not prepared for this market capitalist society. You were told all your life, be a good Soviet citizen, go to school, go to university, do your job, do what you're told. And you did, and you had a decent life. And suddenly all of that's over. And Vladimir Putin is widely seen in Russia as the person who ended that chaos. He comes in, he ends the war in Chechnya, he deals with the threat of terrorism, he stabilizes the country economically, mainly because oil prices are extremely high. And so he's able to share some of that wealth with the people. And so, yes, of course, and also importantly as well, he stabilizes the country by nationalizing the crime and corruption. He is the person who is the chief oligarch, and he has other oligarchs under him who are all appointed. They're all appointed. There is no such thing as an independent, there is no real private property at that level in Russia. If you're a billionaire, you're not really a billionaire. You're a billionaire as long as you are faithful to the regime.
Nobody really knew how you kind of go and undo the communist experiment and try to get back on that locomotive. There were lots of theories. You know, there was shock therapy in Poland. There was a faith that even if it were, however rough it might be, there were going to be some bumps in the road, but now we knew where the road was going. There was a kind of wildness to it, a sense that the old rules no longer obtained and nobody knew what the new rules were. It left open the possibility of, former communist apparatchiks very quickly transitioning, into gangster-style neoliberals who managed to monopolize and steal a lot of the state resources. The transition was not particularly gentle and not necessarily particularly fair at all. So Ukraine was languishing under these conditions. Was mired in corruption scandals. In September 2000, this era is probably personified or symbolized by a brutal murder and an assassination of a Georgian-Ukrainian journalist, young Georgian-Ukrainian journalist, Georgy Gangadze, who had been reporting on corruption, who was assassinated during Kuchma's reign. There wasn't widespread violence in mass against the population, but if you were a dissident journalist or if you were, making trouble in particular, then you were clearly very vulnerable. And Ukraine kind of languished this way until the elections of 2004. And the elections of 2004, the presidential elections, were the elections between two victors, Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko. And Viktor Yanukovych was your kind of post-Soviet gangster type. I mean, not really type, he was a gangster. Close to the Kremlin, representing continuity with what had come before. The presidency would clearly enrich himself and his circle of friends. And then there was Viktor Yushchenko, who seemed to be the person who was westward looking, who was looking towards Europe, who was going to take Ukraine or had visions of taking Ukraine on a path towards eventual European Union integration.